It began with a piercing neigh that froze the entire police stable in silence. Officers instinctively stepped back, startled, because the stallion in the corner wasn't just any horse. He was infamous as the most volatile service horse in the entire city. His restless snorts reverberated through the barn like a warning. Stay away. No handler could tame him anymore. Every attempt ended in failure. Once the most loyal horse on the force, he had become erratic after losing his rider in a tragic operation. Since that day, no one dared come near. He refused food, lashed out at anyone who approached, and pawed the ground with fury whenever a human came close. The officers called him the Beast. Yet one afternoon, when everyone else had lost hope, a little girl in a pink dress wandered fearlessly toward his stall, smiling. "Stop!" the officers shouted, panic rising in their voices. "Sweetheart, don't go near that horse." But she ignored every warning. Looking up at the towering animal, she whispered softly, "It's okay, you're not bad." When her tiny hand touched his muzzle, no one dared move. What happened next left everyone speechless. Before we continue, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. And really, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. I love seeing how far our stories travel. The iron gates of the city's mounted division clattered as a police truck rolled in. Inside, chained and bridled, stood a massive chestnut stallion whose eyes could make even veterans step back. Officers exchanged wary glances. "That's him?" one murmured. "Yeah," another whispered. "That's Ranger, the untouchable." When the handler opened the trailer door, Ranger didn't move. He simply stared, amber eyes unblinking, filled not with rage but with something heavier, grief. Then, without warning, he reared back, the chains pulling tight as the handler stumbled away. The echo of hooves and snorts filled the concrete corridor. No one dared approach. Ranger had been transferred through 5 precincts in just 2 years. Every trainer who tried to work with him walked away scarred physically, emotionally, or both. Reports labeled him uncontrollable, dangerous, beyond saving, but none mentioned the nights he whinnied endlessly for the partner who would never return. Behind the observation window, Captain Reynolds crossed his arms. "We'll give him one last chance," he said grimly. "But if he loses control again, that's it." The room went silent. Everyone knew what "that's it" meant. Ranger was placed in an isolated stall at the far end of the facility. Reinforced doors, steel bars, no other horses nearby. He paced in slow circles, his hooves striking the floor like the ticking of a clock. Each time a handler passed, he let out a low snort of warning. The scars across his face told their own story. Once, he'd been a hero. Now he was just a shadow of what he had been. Night fell. The barn lights dimmed, casting the corridor in a cold, sterile glow. From his stall, Ranger watched officers laugh, eat, and head home. He pressed his muzzle to the bars, listening. The faint hum of the city beyond reminded him of the world he'd lost, the gallop of patrols, the weight of the saddle, the voice that used to call his name. But that voice was gone. A sudden clap of thunder outside made him shudder. His muscles tensed, his mind replaying that terrible night, the explosion, the screams, the silence that followed. A deep, trembling sound escaped his chest, echoing through the empty stable. Everyone feared Ranger for his aggression, but if they looked closer, they'd see the truth. His rage wasn't born from hatred, it was born from heartbreak, and no one, not one soul, had ever dared to reach through that pain. Until, one day, someone would. 2 weeks later, sirens wailed in the early morning fog as a police transport truck pulled up to Riverdale City Precinct. Inside, Ranger stood bound once more, silent and still, eyes fixed on the narrow shaft of light filtering through the slats. The officer driving glanced nervously at his partner. "You sure about this transfer?" he asked. "He's not like the others. The last precinct couldn't handle him." The other officer sighed. "Orders from the top. Riverdale's got better facilities. If anyone can reach him, maybe they can." When the trailer doors opened, a hush fell over the yard. Officers gathered, watching as 2 handlers in protective vests led Ranger out. His coat rippled with tension, muscles taut beneath the sunlight. The bridle gleamed as his low, steady snorts rolled like distant thunder. "Stay back," one handler warned. "He doesn't like direct eye contact." Ranger's ears flicked, scanning his surroundings. Everything was new, scents, sounds, faces. He trusted none of it. The air carried traces of hay, gun oil, and diesel, all familiar yet hollow, now reminders of a world that no longer meant anything to him. Inside the precinct, Captain Reynolds gathered the team for briefing. "This horse has been transferred due to severe aggression," he announced, his tone grave. "The last rider sustained serious injuries. You may observe him, but no one steps into his stall without explicit clearance." A low murmur spread across the group. "So why keep him at all?" one rookie whispered. The captain's expression turned to stone. "Because he's not just a horse," he said quietly. "He was once the finest service animal this force ever had until everything went wrong." The silence that followed was thick with both respect and unease. Ranger was led into the reinforced stable wing, his iron shoes clinking against the concrete floor. He passed rows of calm, obedient horses, their coats gleaming, their riders giving gentle pats as they walked by. Some of them neighed softly, sensing the tension radiating from his body, but Ranger didn't respond. He'd built walls higher than any stall could contain. When the door clanged shut behind him, he lowered his head and retreated into the shadows, a dark figure swallowed by silence. Outside, officers exchanged worried glances. "He's not a horse," one muttered under his breath. "He's a ticking bomb." None of them knew that behind the hardened glare was a loyal spirit, fractured, still waiting, hoping for a reason to trust again. And that reason was already on her way. The morning sun poured through the high glass panes of Riverdale Precinct, glinting off polished badges and steaming coffee cups. Officer Jerry Wesley sat at his desk, flipping through a slim folder labeled Mounted Unit Transfer. Ranger. His brows furrowed deeper with every page he read. Uncontrollable, multiple attacks. Severe handler injury. The words jumped out like red flags. He sighed, closing the file. "Not again," he muttered. Jerry had spent over a decade working with service horses, training everything from crowd control mounts to search and rescue units. He'd seen loyalty, bravery, and devotion in their purest form. But he'd also seen the others, the broken ones, scarred by fear, trauma, and loss. And Ranger, from everything he'd read, wasn't just damaged. He was lost. Captain Reynolds entered, his face drawn and serious. "Jerry," he said, placing a hand on his shoulder, "I need you to evaluate him." Jerry looked up sharply. "Captain, with all due respect, I'm not signing up for suicide." "Have you read his file?" "I have," Reynolds replied evenly. "But you're the only trainer with enough experience to give him a real chance. Everyone else is too afraid to even step near his stall." Jerry leaned back in his chair, staring out the window. The city hummed with sirens and life, but all he could hear was the echo of a promise he'd once made the day his old partner, a gray mare named Shadow, was shot during a protest riot. He'd sworn then never to get too close again. Losing one partner had been unbearable. Losing another? Impossible. "Why risk it?" Jerry finally said. "He's unpredictable. If he can't be retrained, he's a danger to everyone." Reynolds hesitated before answering. "Maybe. Or maybe he's just misunderstood." His voice softened. "I've seen animals like him before, angry, withdrawn, terrified. They don't need control. They need someone who listens." Jerry didn't respond. His eyes dropped to the photo, clipped to the file, a shot of Ranger baring his teeth behind a bridle. His gaze caught between fury and grief. After a moment, Jerry closed the folder and stood. "I'll take a look," he said quietly, "but no promises." As he walked down the corridor toward the stables, a strange unease gripped his chest. He didn't know it yet, but this meeting would alter both their lives forever. The fluorescent lights hummed softly as Jerry stood behind the reinforced glass, watching Ranger pace restlessly inside his stall. Every movement was sharp, anxious, each stomp of a hoof an echo of the storm inside him. His ears twitched at every sound, every shadow, as if danger lurked just beyond the next breath. Jerry had seen aggression before, but this was something else. Ranger wasn't just angry, he was haunted. "Where did he come from?" Jerry asked, turning to Officer Diaz, who was jotting notes beside him. Diaz sighed. "He's military trained, served overseas in a mounted patrol unit with Sergeant Cole Evans. They were heroes, saved an entire convoy once." Jerry's eyes returned to Ranger. "What happened?" Diaz hesitated before replying. "IED attack. Their patrol was hit. Evans didn't make it. Ranger survived, but barely. After that, he wouldn't follow commands, kicked the medics who tried to help. They sent him home, but every division since has failed to reach him." Jerry's chest tightened. He knew that kind of loss, the kind that leaves you hollow. Through the glass, Ranger pawed the ground and let out a low, trembling snort. Then he froze, his gaze locking onto Jerry's as though he understood they were talking about him. The air between them felt heavy, Electric. Jerry didn't look away. He held Ranger's stare not in defiance, but in quiet recognition. And for a fleeting second, something flickered in the horse's golden eyes, confusion, maybe even familiarity. Then it vanished, replaced once more by that cold, guarded fire. Later that evening, when the precinct had gone quiet, Jerry sat at his desk going through old service records. Inside the folder were photos of Ranger and Sergeant Evans side by side, coated in dust and triumph, smiling after a long mission. The connection between them was undeniable. In one photo, Evans crouched beside the stallion, his hand resting gently on Ranger's neck, pride gleaming in his eyes. The caption beneath read, "The perfect team." Jerry exhaled, his voice low. "No wonder he's like this," he murmured. He lost everything. Across the stable, Ranger lay curled in the corner of his stall, his head resting against the straw. His ears twitched slightly, as if he could still hear the echoes of a voice calling his name through the chaos commands shouted over explosions, the whip of desert wind, the distant hum of engines. Sometimes, in the stillness of night, he would jolt awake, neighing sharply, trapped in memories that refused to fade. To the officers, he was nothing more than a dangerous animal. But to Jerry, he looked like a soldier still stuck on a battlefield long after the war had ended. As thunder rolled outside, Jerry pressed his hand to the glass and whispered, "You don't have to fight anymore. You just need someone to remind you how to live." What he didn't know was that the one who would remind Ranger wouldn't be him, it would be someone much smaller and far braver. The next morning, tension hung thick in the air. Rain tapped gently against the station windows as officers gathered near the stables. A new handler, Officer Grant, adjusted his gloves and padded sleeve nervously. "I've worked with aggressive horses before," he said, his voice trying to sound steady. "I can handle him." Captain Reynolds gave a curt nod. "Be careful. This isn't just any horse." Behind the reinforced stall door, Ranger stood motionless, muscles taut, ears flicking toward the sounds outside. He sensed their presence before anyone entered. The moment the latch creaked, his entire body tightened like a loaded spring. Grant stepped forward, holding the lead rope with a calm tone. "Easy, boy," he murmured. "No one's here to hurt you." Ranger's amber eyes locked on him, sharp and unblinking, testing every move. The room went silent except for the faint echo of Grant's boots against the concrete floor. Each step felt like a countdown. "Stay ready," someone whispered behind the viewing glass. Grant crouched a few feet away, voice gentle. "Good boy, we're going to be friends." He extended a gloved hand, shaking slightly. That was his mistake. Ranger lunged. The air cracked with the sound of chains snapping tight, his hooves slamming against the ground as a fierce neigh echoed through the corridor. Grant stumbled backward, his sleeve ripping under the force while officers shouted and forced the stall door shut. Ranger reared up violently, eyes wide not with hatred but with terror, his breathing ragged and heavy. The hallway erupted in chaos. "Get him out of there, now!" someone yelled. Jerry rushed in as handlers dragged Grant away, his arm bleeding where the sleeve had failed. "I told you not to push him," Jerry snapped. "He's not ready for that." Grant, pale and shaken, muttered, "That thing's not a horse, it's a monster." But Jerry looked through the bars and saw something else. Beneath Ranger's fury was fear deep, trembling fear. His chest heaved as his eyes darted from face to face, waiting for another explosion, another command, another loss. Captain Reynolds' voice broke through the noise. "That's it. We're done. If no one can get through to him by the end of the week, I'll have to authorize termination." The words hit Jerry like a stone. He stared at Ranger, still trembling in the corner, and something inside him refused to accept it. He didn't know why, but he sensed the story wasn't over. Somewhere inside that battered creature, a spark still burned, waiting for the right soul to find it. And that soul was already on her way. It was a slow Saturday morning at the precinct, the kind where paperwork stacked high, coffee cooled too quickly, and time itself seemed to move at half speed. The rain clouds hung low over the city, the steady hum of fluorescent lights filling the halls. Nothing about the day felt unusual, until the front doors opened. A woman stepped in, holding the hand of a little girl. She was in her early 30s, dressed in a faded denim jacket, her eyes tired but kind. The child, no older than 6, clutched a worn teddy bear, her wide eyes taking in every detail. "Can I help you, ma'am?" the desk officer asked. "Yes," the woman replied softly. "I'm Jenny Carter. My husband was an officer here before he passed. I just wanted to show my daughter where her father used to work." The officer's expression softened. "Of course, Mrs. Carter. I'm so sorry for your loss." While the adult spoke, the little girl Hannah wandered a few steps down the hallway. Her tiny shoes squeaked softly on the tile as she peeked toward the stable corridor. From behind the heavy doors came faint, rhythmic sounds, the restless stomp of hooves, the low whinny of a horse. "Mommy," she whispered, tugging Jenny's sleeve. "Are there horses here?" Jenny smiled faintly. "Yes, sweetheart. Police horses. But we can't go in there, okay?" Hannah nodded, though her curious eyes lingered on that hallway, the one that would soon change everything. At that same moment, Jerry was in the stable wing, standing quietly beside Ranger's stall. The stallion lay in the far corner, motionless, his eyes dull and distant. The air was thick with silence until, suddenly, his ears flicked, nostrils flaring as he lifted his head sharply. Something had shifted. He rose to his feet in one swift movement, his muscles tightening, gaze fixed on the entrance. But instead of a warning snort or a defensive stomp, a faint, uncertain whicker escaped his throat. Jerry frowned, puzzled. "What is it, boy?" he murmured. Then, through the narrow glass pane in the door, he saw her, a small girl standing just beyond, her pink dress a burst of color against the gray hallway. Her wide, curious eyes met Ranger's across the distance. Before anyone could react, she took a step closer. "Wait!" Jerry shouted, hurrying toward the door. But Hannah was already reaching for the handle, her little fingers curling around the metal. Ranger didn't move. He simply watched her, unblinking, his eyes locked on hers, not with fury this time, but with something gentler, something achingly familiar. And in that fragile, wordless moment, the story of an untouchable horse began to change forever. The hallway fell still, as Hannah's tiny hand pressed against the cold metal. Jerry froze mid-stride, his heart leaping to his throat. "No! Don't open that!" he yelled, his boots striking hard against the floor. But the child didn't flinch. She turned her head slightly, her voice soft and innocent. "It's okay," she whispered, almost to herself. "He's not bad." The latch clicked. The heavy door creaked open. Every officer nearby stiffened, breaths caught. One wrong move, one sudden noise, and the stallion behind that door could strike in an instant. Jerry lunged forward, but he was too late. Hannah had already stepped inside. The atmosphere shifted immediately. The fluorescent lights hummed faintly as Ranger lifted his head, his golden eyes following the tiny figure now standing inside his stall. Time seemed to pause. Jerry's pulse hammered as he watched Ranger's body go rigid, his stance tight, ears forward, every muscle ready. The deep rumble of a warning neigh vibrated through the air, low and threatening. "Hannah!" Jenny's voice cracked from the hallway as her footsteps approached in panic. But the little girl didn't run or scream. She simply stood still, clutching her teddy bear, her eyes wide but calm. "Hi," she whispered softly. Ranger blinked. The sound in his throat faltered. His head tilted slightly, a flicker of confusion passing through his gaze. No one had spoken to him like that in years, not since his old rider. That tender tone, that trust untainted by fear, didn't belong in a place like this. Jerry stopped at the doorway, hand braced on the frame, ready to intervene. One wrong move could end it all. Every instinct screamed at him to pull her away, and yet, something held him still. Ranger wasn't attacking. He was listening. Hannah took another small step forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's okay, horsey. I know you're sad." Her words floated in the air like a fragile bridge connecting two broken worlds. Ranger's breathing slowed. The tension in his shoulders loosened just slightly. The beast they all feared stood perfectly still, caught between instinct and memory, between the need to protect himself and the longing to feel gentleness again. Jerry didn't move, neither did Ranger. The entire stable seemed to hold its breath. For the first time in years, someone had looked into the eyes of the untouchable stallion and seen not danger, but a soul. The space around them felt heavy, charged with disbelief and awe. Officers crowded behind the observation glass, frozen in silence, afraid to even breathe too loudly. All eyes were fixed on the small girl standing just a few feet from the most feared horse in the unit. Ranger's flanks trembled, his chest rising and falling in uneven rhythm. His ears flicked, nostrils quivering as he studied her every movement. Instinct urged him to stay alert, yet something about her presence made him hesitate. Hannah took one slow step closer. Her shoes squeaked softly on the floor. Tilting her head, her voice trembled but carried warmth. "You're not bad," she whispered. "You're just scared." Aren't you? Ranger blinked, uncertain. No shouting, no commands, no fear, just that gentle voice like the one he'd known long ago. From behind the glass, Jerry's heartbeat roared in his ears. Every impulse told him to pull her back, but something deeper told him to wait. Ranger's posture had changed. The sharpness in his eyes was dimming, replaced by something unsure, almost childlike. Hannah crouched slowly, setting her teddy bear down on the straw. "See?" she said softly, nudging it forward. "He's nice, too. You can smell him if you want." Ranger's head tilted again. His tail flicked once, not in anger, but in hesitation. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he took one step forward. The sound of his hoof striking the ground echoed through the stillness. The metal of his bridle caught the light. Everyone held their breath. Hannah smiled. "Good boy," she whispered. Her hand, small and trembling, reached out and pressed gently against the cold steel bars. Ranger froze. For a heartbeat, the world stopped moving. Then, slowly, the stallion lowered his head. With a trembling breath, he brushed his muzzle against the little girl's fingertips. A faint, quivering sound escaped his throat, a soft, fragile whicker that shattered every barrier between them. Gasps erupted from behind the glass. Jerry's eyes widened in disbelief. The creature that had once sent grown men running in fear had just allowed a child to touch him. Ranger closed his eyes briefly, as if surrendering to a memory one he thought he'd never feel again. And from that moment forward, something within him began to heal. No one spoke for several long seconds. The officers crowded behind the observation window stood frozen, faces pale, eyes wide. The stable that had once echoed with restless stamping and warning snorts now fell silent, the kind of silence that carried reverence. Jerry exhaled slowly, barely able to believe what he'd seen. This can't be real," he murmured. Inside the stall, Hannah giggled softly, her tiny hand still resting on Ranger's nose. The powerful stallion who had once charged at grown men now stood completely still, except for the faint flick of his tail, hesitant, unsure, as if rediscovering what peace felt like. "Sweetheart, step away!" Jenny's panicked voice broke through the moment as she reached the door, her face tight with fear. "That's a dangerous horse." But Hannah turned with a bright smile. "No, Mommy. He's not dangerous. He's sad." "Aw." Jenny froze, her breath catching as she took in the sight before her, the creature everyone feared standing quietly in front of her daughter, his eyes soft, almost human. Jerry eased the door open, his hand hovering near the tranquilizer on his belt just in case. "Easy," he said gently, motioning for Jenny not to make any sudden moves. But Ranger didn't even glance at him. His gaze stayed locked on Hannah. When the little girl turned to leave, a low, aching sound escaped him, half a sigh, half a plea. It wasn't anger, it was longing. Jerry heard it immediately and whispered, "He doesn't want her to go." That afternoon, after Jenny and Hannah had left, Jerry stayed behind in the observation room, replaying the security footage over and over. He watched the way Ranger's entire body stilled, the shift in his eyes, the moment he lowered his head. He'd trained dozens of service horses and studied behavioral rehabilitation for years, but he'd never seen anything like this. Ranger hadn't reacted to Hannah as if she were a threat or a trainer. He'd responded as though he knew her. Leaning closer to the monitor, Jerry paused the video right when Ranger pressed his muzzle to the child's fingers. His throat tightened. There was something unmistakable in those golden eyes, a blend of pain and love, intertwined. "What did you see in her, boy?" he whispered. For the first time since Ranger's arrival, something in Jerry's heart shifted. This wasn't just a behavioral case, it was a story written in the language of the soul. And deep down, he knew he had to let them meet again. By morning, the precinct buzzed with whispers. The story of the little girl who'd touched the untouchable horse spread through every hallway. Officers replayed the footage again and again, each time shaking their heads. Some called it a miracle, others dismissed it as luck. But Jerry knew it was something more. He couldn't forget the look in Ranger's eyes when Hannah walked away, that hollow sorrow, like losing something precious all over again. Against all regulations, Jerry made a decision. "Let her come back," he told Captain Reynolds. The captain's expression hardened. "You've lost your mind, Wesley. That child was inches from disaster." "I know," Jerry replied calmly. "But she wasn't hurt. He trusts her. If there's even a chance she can reach him, we have to try." Reynolds hesitated for a long moment, then sighed. "One visit, supervised." That afternoon, Jenny and Hannah returned. The moment Ranger saw her, everything changed. His ears pricked forward, tail lifted, and for the first time in months, his eyes seemed alive again. Jenny gripped her daughter's hand tightly. "Remember, sweetheart," she whispered, gentle and slow. Hannah nodded and approached the stall. "Hi, Ranger," she said softly, like greeting an old friend. "I missed you." The stallion tilted his head and let out a quiet rumble deep in his chest. When she crouched by the bars again, he pressed his muzzle forward almost instantly, as if he'd been waiting for her. "Good boy," Hannah whispered, slipping her fingers through the gap in the gate. Jerry watched, utterly amazed. With each visit, the change became more visible. Within days, Ranger began responding not just to Hannah's presence, but to her voice. When she said stand, he stood still. When she smiled, he whinnied softly in return. He began eating again, resting calmly, no longer pacing or snorting in distress. The fury that once defined him started to fade. Other officers began to notice too. "You're not going to believe this," Officer Diaz said one evening. "He actually neighed when I walked by like a normal horse. I thought I was imagining things." Jerry smiled faintly, his gaze still fixed on Ranger. He's remembering what trust feels like. That week, Hannah came by every day after school. She brought small crayon drawings of herself, her mother, and Ranger standing together under a golden sundae. She taped them to the wall near his stall, and each time, the stallion would stand and stare at them quietly, as though he understood. Jenny often stood nearby, her hand pressed to her chest, eyes shimmering with tears. "I've never seen anything like this," she whispered. "Neither have I," Jerry replied softly. What no one realized was that Ranger's transformation was only beginning. Beneath that fragile bond, something deeper was taking root. A connection shaped by destiny, one that would soon uncover a truth none of them were ready to face. Days turned into weeks, and the bond between Hannah and Ranger grew into something deeper than anyone could explain. The once uncontrollable police horse now waited by the gate each morning, ears pricked, tail swishing gently against the stall door. The instant the sound of small footsteps echoed through the corridor, his entire body relaxed. Jerry couldn't deny it, Ranger was changing, but something about the way the stallion looked at the girl kept tugging at the back of his mind. There was recognition in his eyes, as if he already knew her from a distant past. One late evening, long after the precinct had emptied, Jerry sat alone in his office flipping through Ranger's old service records. The folder was worn, its edges curling from years of handling. Most of the pages contained standard reports, training logs, commendations, mission notes, but tucked near the back was a folded photograph. Jerry opened it carefully, his breath catching as the image came into view. It showed Sergeant Cole Evans kneeling beside a younger, bright-eyed Ranger. Next to them stood a woman holding a toddler with pigtails and a radiant smile, the same smile that now filled the stables every afternoon. Jerry froze, staring. He turned the photograph over, and written in neat handwriting were the words, "Ranger Daddy's brave partner. Love, Hannah." The world seemed to stop spinning. The little girl who had soothed the most volatile horse in the division was the daughter of his fallen rider. Jerry leaned back in his chair, the realization crashing over him like a wave. Every piece fell into place, Ranger's confusion, the soft whinnies, that unexplainable bond. He hadn't simply recognized her scent or voice, he had remembered his family. The next morning, Jerry found Jenny waiting in the lobby as usual. He hesitated before asking softly, "Ma'am, did your husband ever serve in the mounted unit?" Her eyes dimmed, sadness surfacing in their depths. "Yes," she whispered. "Cole Evans. He was killed on duty." Jerry exhaled shakily. "Your husband's partner was Ranger." Jenny froze, lips parting in shock. "That horse? He was Cole's?" Jerry nodded slowly. "He never forgot him. That's why he trusted your daughter from the start." Tears welled in Jenny's eyes as she looked down the hall toward the stable. At that very moment, Hannah knelt by the gate, laughing softly as Ranger pressed his head against the bars. Jenny's voice trembled. "He remembers us. Oh." And for the first time in years, Ranger lifted his gaze not with fear or pain, but with recognition of the only family he had left. That night, the city was swallowed by a brutal storm. Rain lashed against rooftops, wind howled through the streets, and thunder rumbled like distant artillery. Sirens wailed through Riverdale, warning citizens to stay indoors, but at the precinct, one restless heart refused to settle Ranger's. The first crack of thunder jolted him awake. His ears shot up, body trembling. Lightning illuminated the stable, white flashes slicing across the walls. In an instant, he was no longer there, he was back in the desert, the explosion, the scream of his fallen rider. Panic took hold. He began pacing, stamping, snorting, the echo of his hooves reverberating down the corridor. Officer Diaz, working the night shift, noticed the agitation through the security feed. Jerry, he called over the intercom, your boy's losing it again. Jerry, already pulling on his jacket, muttered under his breath, "It's the storm. He can't handle the sound." PTSD response. But before Jerry could reach the stable, another bolt of lightning struck nearby. The thunderclap that followed was deafening. Startled beyond reason, Ranger reared violently, striking the door with his hooves. The latch burst open under the force, and within seconds, he was gone, a blur of muscle and fear vanishing into the storm. By the time Jerry reached the stall, rain was already whipping through the open doorway. "Damn it, Ranger," he shouted, sprinting into the night. Meanwhile, across town, Jenny and Hannah were driving home from a late grocery trip when their car sputtered and stalled near an old bridge. Rain hammered down in relentless sheets. Jenny twisted the key again. "Nothing. We'll wait it out," she said, forcing calm into her voice. But Hannah's gaze drifted to the fogged-up window, her eyes wide. "Mommy," she whispered, "Ranger's outside." Jenny blinked. "Sweetheart, it's just the storm." Before she could finish, a shadow emerged in a flash of lightning, a massive stallion, drenched and trembling, his eyes wild with confusion. Ranger stood in the middle of the road, staring directly at their car. "Ranger?" Jenny breathed. The horse let out a loud, urgent neigh, then turned sharply and galloped toward the nearby woods. Hannah pressed her hands to the glass. "He wants us to follow him." Hannah, no," Jenny cried. But the little girl had already flung the car door open and dashed into the rain. "Hannah!" Jenny screamed, chasing after her through the storm. The ground was slick with mud, the rain relentless, lightning splitting the sky in violent bursts. Ahead, Hannah vanished behind a cluster of fallen trees. "Ranger!" Jenny's voice cracked, lost in the roar of wind and thunder. At that same moment, Jerry's police radio crackled to life just as he reached the main road. Report of a missing child near the East Bridge, possible connection to a runaway service horse. His blood ran cold. Slamming his foot on the gas, he gritted his teeth. Somewhere out there, a terrified little girl and a broken warhorse had run straight into the heart of the storm, and fate was about to test their bond like never before. The tempest raged without mercy. Trees bent under the force of the wind as sheets of rain blurred the world into silver chaos. Lightning tore through the sky while Jerry's cruiser splashed through flooded streets, tires slicing through the water. "This is Officer Wesley," he said into the radio, voice taut. "I'm en route to East Bridge. We've got a missing child and a service horse loose." "Copy that," came the dispatcher's voice through the static. "Be advised, road collapse reported near the forest line. Proceed with caution." Jerry pressed harder on the gas. "Hold on, Ranger. Don't do anything stupid." Deep in the woods, Hannah stumbled through the mud, her pink dress soaked and clinging to her. "Ranger," she called out, her voice trembling. "Where are you?" A sharp, distant neigh cut through the rain, faint but unmistakable. Hannah turned toward the sound, slipping, falling, then scrambling back to her feet. She pushed through the tangled branches until she reached a clearing, and there he was. The massive stallion stood tall against the storm, drenched and shaking, but alive. "Ranger," she cried in relief. The horse answered with a powerful neigh and trotted toward her, his breath steaming in the cold air. She threw her arms around his neck without hesitation, sobbing into his wet mane. "You found me." But Ranger wasn't calm. His ears twitched, muscles tense. He let out a sharp snort, staring past her into the shadows. Lightning flashed, and Hannah saw it, a massive tree, uprooted by the storm, teetering precariously on the edge of the slope above them. Before she could react, the ground beneath her gave way. The muddy earth crumbled, pulling her down toward the ravine below. She screamed, but before she hit the bottom, Ranger lunged forward, clamping his teeth into the back of her jacket. He planted his hooves deep into the mud, muscles straining against gravity. Rain blinded him, mud splattered his face, but he refused to let go. Inch by inch, he pulled her up, his body trembling under the weight. "Hold on, boy," Hannah gasped, clutching his mane. With one last desperate heave, Ranger dragged her to safety just as the enormous tree crashed down behind them, splitting the earth with a thunderous crack. Hannah collapsed onto the ground, panting, her hands still tangled in his reins. "You saved me," she whispered, voice breaking. But Ranger didn't move right away. He stood over her protectively, his chest heaving, ears pinned back. A deep gash streaked along his flank where the tree had grazed him, blood mixing with rain as it ran down his side. Moments later, Jerry burst through the trees, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "Hannah!" he shouted, his voice raw with fear. "Here!" she cried weakly. "Ranger saved me." Jerry dropped to his knees beside her, pulling the shaking child into his arms. Then his gaze fell on the horse, bleeding, limping, but still standing guard over her. "Good boy," Jerry whispered, voice thick. "You did it." Ranger turned his head toward him, his eyes cloudy but calm, as if to say, "She's safe now." Then his legs buckled, and he collapsed into the mud. "Hang on, buddy," Jerry said hoarsely, cradling his head. "We're not losing you tonight." One. By the time the storm began to ease, the wail of sirens echoed through the valley. Under the red glow of emergency lights, a wounded soldier and a little girl were carried back to safety, bound forever by a love that had conquered fear, pain, and fate itself. The hospital corridors hummed with the steady rhythm of machines. The storm had passed, leaving behind that eerie stillness that follows chaos. The clock on the wall ticked slowly as Jerry sat outside the emergency room, soaked and shivering, his hands clasped tight. Across from him, Jenny held Hannah close, her eyes red from crying. Ranger had been rushed into surgery the moment they arrived. His flank was torn open, and he'd lost a dangerous amount of blood. The veterinarian had said they would do everything possible, but Jerry knew the odds were slim. "Mommy," Hannah whispered, her voice trembling. "He's going to be okay, right?" Jenny brushed a tear from her daughter's cheek. "He's strong, sweetheart. He saved you. He's not giving up now." Jerry turned away, jaw clenched, holding back the weight in his chest. He'd seen heroes fall before men and animals alike, but this one was different. This one had finally found a reason to live again. Hours crawled by. Finally, the door opened, and a weary vet stepped out, her scrubs stained. "He's stable," she said gently. "The wound was bad, but he's a fighter. He's resting now." Hannah shot to her feet. "Can I see him?" The vet hesitated, then smiled. "Just for a minute." "Isn't." The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and hay. Machines beeped softly beside the table where Ranger lay, his side bandaged, breathing slow but steady. His coat had been shaved around the wound, an IV trailing from his neck. Hannah approached carefully, hands trembling. "Hey boy," she whispered. "It's me, M." Ranger's ear flicked, then his eyes fluttered open, cloudy at first, then clear. The moment he saw her, his tail gave a weak thump against the table. Jerry and Jenny stood in the doorway, eyes glistening as Hannah leaned close and hugged him gently around the neck. "You came back," she whispered, "just like Daddy said you would." Ranger let out a faint whinny, pressing his nose against her shoulder. It was the same sound he'd made years ago, the one Cole Evans used to soothe him on restless nights overseas. Jenny covered her mouth, tears spilling. "He remembers." Jerry swallowed hard. "He never forgot." The storm had taken its toll, but what it left behind was something unbreakable, a reunion of souls bound by love, memory, and destiny. As dawn broke and sunlight streamed through the window, Ranger drifted back to sleep, not in fear this time, but in peace, knowing his family had found him again. 2 months later, Riverdale looked transformed. Snow blanketed the city in soft white, and the precinct courtyard glimmered under the morning sunday. A small crowd of officers gathered near the flagpole, their uniforms crisp, their expressions proud. At the center stood Jerry, Jenny, and little Hannah, and beside them, wearing a polished silver badge on his new harness, was Ranger. The once feared stallion stood tall, his coat gleaming, eyes calm and clear. The legend of the untouchable horse had been replaced by a new one, a story of redemption and courage. Captain Reynolds stepped forward, his voice steady. "Today, we honor a soldier who reminded us what loyalty truly means. Ranger, for bravery beyond duty and for saving a child's life, you are hereby named an honorary member of the Riverdale Mounted Unit." Applause filled the courtyard, echoing through the cold air. Hannah clapped the loudest, her hands pink from the chill. "That's my Ranger," she said proudly, her laughter bright as sunlight. Jerry smiled, eyes misty, and knelt beside the stallion, stroking his neck. "You did it, buddy," he whispered. "You finally found home again." "Oh." Ranger turned his head toward Jenny and Hannah, his new family, before gently pressing his muzzle into Jerry's palm in quiet gratitude. Snowflakes drifted down, melting on his warm coat. Hannah ran circles around him, giggling, while he followed with steady steps, tail swishing in rhythm. Jenny stood back, hands tucked into her coat, watching them with a soft smile. Jerry joined her quietly. "You know," he said, his voice warm, "I think your husband would have been proud. Ranger never stopped waiting for him." Jenny wiped her tears and whispered, "Maybe he wasn't waiting. Maybe he was just waiting for us." They stood together in the falling snow, the silence between them peaceful, full. As evening painted the sky in hues of gold and pink, Hannah sat beside Ranger on the station steps, leaning against him, her small fingers tangled in his mane. The silver badge on his harness caught the fading light, shining like a medal of honor. From the doorway, Jerry watched them, his heart finally at rest. For years, Ranger had carried the ghosts of his past, but now, surrounded by love and laughter, he had found what every soldier searches for after the war, a reason to live again. Ranger lifted his head toward the horizon, ears forward, eyes bright. For the first time in years, his world held no thunder, no fear, only peace. And beside him, the little girl who had mended his broken heart whispered softly, "Welcome home, Ranger."